Me and my boyfriend love to camp. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to go to the coast because we had a Friday off from our classes in university and decided to hike and camp out for the weekend. We had a 3-day plan to stay in 3 different towns and hike to each place. This story is about the first place we stayed in. The first town was barely a town. It was more like a bunch of small houses and farmlands and very few people. It was off season, so normally there would be some tourists there since the main attraction is a huge abandoned city left over from the times of the ancient Greeks. Anyway, since there was 5 to 6 camping grounds available, one of which was highly recommended on TripAdvisor and the likes of, we did not bother calling beforehand. We simply headed there and then straight to the camping area. Upon reaching it, we saw the gate open. Not really so unusual, but when we entered, no one seemed to be there. We knocked and called out for someone and no one responded except the outdoor bar was all open with expensive bottles of alcohol lined up and food left on the kitchen tables as we saw from the window, so they could not have gone far. My boyfriend found it a bit strange that they would leave everything open like that, but assuming it was a small community with no crime, we did not think more. We went to some other camping grounds to ask if they were open. The first one we went to said they were closed because the grounds were very messy these days, but they recommended us another place. We asked them about the first ground we had went to, and strangely the man said don't go there. When we asked why, he said, just don't. I don't really recommend you going there. Anyway, the other place that he told us about was also closed, and luckily in the meantime I found a signboard for the first place and it had their number on it. We called them, and a man picked up and told us that he and his wife are out for a couple of hours, but they will be back by the evening. He said we could set up our camp and that we would meet later. The place was a bit secluded, but it was quite picturesque, and we set our camp and left. We spent the whole day exploring and hiking around, and after a tiring day, around 10 p.m. after dinner, we started heading back. This is where things got really creepy. When we got back, we found the place was still empty. No one had returned, and it was quite late, and they said that they had decided not to return tonight, but that we could leave the money under a table mat by the door. They said the kitchen and bathrooms are open if we need to use them. The place was dark, and the yard where we had set up camp was huge and without lighting. My boyfriend immediately started to feel a bit uneasy. He was concerned why 2 business owners would have their property completely open to 2 total strangers with a bar full of unopened bottles and a half-opened house. As we walked towards our camp, he kept subtly expressing his uneasiness and kept looking around. He's usually pretty calm, so I told him if he's really feeling so strongly about this, we can just go to the pension where we had dinner earlier and stay the night there in a hotel room. He opened a flashlight on his phone and kept looking around, getting more and more uneasy. We agreed to pack up our camp and leave. I began to pick it up since it requires a lot of folding and he's already anxious. I told him to just stand and give me light as I packed it up, except constantly he would move the light and check the area, and I kept getting irritated because I could sense his worry, and at the time, I could not pack fast enough because I couldn't see. At one point, he even told me in a slightly bitchy way to hurry up, and as soon as I folded the camp, we stuffed it in its bag and hurriedly packed our shit and scooted. He still seemed super anxious, and I told him to relax. Just telling this part gives me the chills all over again. The road back to the main area of town was dark and lonely. This is when he told me there is something that I wanted to say, but not while we were still in the grounds. What was it? I asked. He hesitated, then he said he did not want to freak me out, but he was sure that he saw someone lurking in the dark behind the wooden cabins and by the bathrooms twice. No one was supposed to be there except us. I got the chills, but I still tried to rationalize, saying it's a farm area, there's a lot of animals, maybe a cat moving around. but he was sure it was a human figure walking like a human. That is why he kept checking and wanted to hurry so much, and that's why he was telling me to hush up and keep my voice down. I almost had tears in my eyes at this point, and the hair on my back was standing. I kept looking back and almost running at this point to the lighted area, and only really got to relax until we reached the pension and booked a room there, got the key, locked and checked it twice. I'm generally a skeptical person, but I really do believe my boyfriend did not just see things. I don't know who that was back there, or what could have happened. If anything, I don't care to know. Dark and isolated places have always creeped me out anyway. Person lurking in the dark, let's never ever meet. In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto, and we were stuck living together after the breakup, as we did not know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto. It's really beautiful, lands of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. He decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field, bordered by gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beer. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a pretty good night. We turned in just after midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably 1:30. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kinda groggy, and it took a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was insistent, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided we would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, "It's not a coyote, it's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally I would have thought he was messing with me, but I've never seen someone look that scared, and I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really did not sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me just to look out the tent flap to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust. That's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was standing a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to piss off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you piss off? We are trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we did not waste any time. We started yelling again, "Seriously, piss off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't piss off, we're going to call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off, sounding like he was moving towards the road. We laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and we were pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts, I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We really haven't ever talked about it since that day. So there you go. That's my weird story. I'll always wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there and what was wrong with him. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer, but seemed like he was testing who was in the tent. Guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad. For reference, I was a 19-year-old female at the time, still female of course, just a little older. I loved camping anytime with my friends and I came home from college. We would load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded yet within a safe distance to civilization. I could run and get help. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, so I make a little camp and get a fire going. I had not brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, reading and looking around the area. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right. Then I see a doe bolt from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with the armful of wood that I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling at a stick I had been messing with. Around 1, I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigarettes, so I'd passed out relatively quick. About 2 a.m. I started hearing footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or other animal, more likely a raccoon, because I had probably left some food out. I'm still on guard though. About 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I did not shit my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed. I desperately wanted to thrust a knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding on hope that it was some of my buddies from a frat joking with me. And then as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going to go to sleep. All of a sudden, at about 4 o'clock, I realized I should put my boots on so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes blaring. I freak the hell out and run out of the tent. I got back 2 steps before something grabs me around my mouth. I open my mouth to scream, but instead of the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down and his finger popped off. He screamed, his hand pulled away, with the missing digit falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill I was camping on. I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to. A little sorority girl in a white beater, boxers, and steel-toe shoes. I also had some blood that had oozed out of my lip from the finger, but because I also managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my lip as well, I told them what happened. They called the police, got some real clothing, and the man at the house made me a whiskey and coke. When the cops got there, they checked it out. Cops went to check it out, and when they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw just made me scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire earlier. The finger was also gone. The kicker is they never caught the guy. Alright, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for watching.